Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we are going to step back in time, all the way to the 1950s, a decade often remembered for its post-war optimism, pastel kitchens, and perfectly manicured lawns. But beneath the surface of suburbia and charming vintage advertisements, life was not quite so picture-perfect, especially if you were a single mother. So, take a deep breath, settle into your favorite chair, and let us travel to a world that might feel foreign, yet reveals so much about resilience, social pressures, and the quiet heroism of women who navigated impossible circumstances every single day. Picture this, it is the early morning of a crisp spring day in 1954. The neighborhood is quiet, apart from the distant hum of the milk truck and the occasional bark from a dog in someone else's yard. A single mother wakes up in a small post-war bungalow, linoleum floors slightly cracked, curtains drawn just enough to keep the sun from glaring into her eyes but not enough to hide her from the prying gaze of neighbors who are already awake, already judging, and already whispering behind lace curtains. In the 1950s, community scrutiny was constant. Every detail of her life, from what she wore, to how her children were dressed, to whether her house looked orderly, was quietly monitored. A missing hat on a coat rack, a slightly unkempt lawn, or even the way she made her coffee could trigger gossip that spread faster than a newspaper headline. Now, imagine starting your day like this, without a spouse's support, without apps to manage schedules, without quick delivery options, without modern conveniences like dishwashers or smartphones to distract from the constant pressure. The day begins not with a sunrise, but with the knowledge that every step, every action, is being silently evaluated. Instant coffee, often bitter and weak, becomes both a lifeline and a symbol of survival. The kitchen, the hub of domestic life, is already filled with challenges, preparing breakfast from limited ingredients, ensuring children are dressed appropriately, and maintaining some sense of normalcy while the world outside expects perfection. Breakfast itself is more than a meal. It is a test of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and sometimes imagination. With a small selection of bread, a can of peaches, and a lone egg, a mother must transform scarcity into nourishment, using creativity to make her children feel fed, cared for, and loved. It is a delicate balance between practicality and illusion, presenting a household that looks functional and harmonious even when every corner of the home whispers of the struggles that are carefully hidden from public view. This is not just cooking, it is a daily performance of competence under scrutiny. As the children wake, bleary-eyed and hungry, the morning routine transforms into a choreographed chaos. Socks are missing, shoes are mismatched, hair tangles refuse to be tamed. And yet, the single mother moves through it all with practiced efficiency, managing arguments, adjusting collars, smoothing cowlicks, and occasionally improvising hairstyles to meet societal expectations of neatness. Every morning is a marathon, a mental and physical exercise in problem-solving, resilience, and emotional labor. The challenges are not simply logistical, they are psychological. The mother must maintain composure under judgmental eyes, projecting calm even when her internal world is anything but. Outside, the world continues to watch. Neighbors peer through windows, comparing children, homes, and routines. Gossip spreads like wildfire, and a single mother quickly learns that every minor misstep is magnified, every small victory is quietly noted but rarely acknowledged. Walking her children to school is an exercise in diplomacy and endurance. She navigates social judgment with the precision of a tightrope walker, acknowledging friendly faces, offering smiles, and maintaining a brisk pace as if to signal that everything is perfectly ordinary, even when it is not. Among other single mothers, there is a quiet camaraderie, a shared understanding communicated through subtle gestures and knowing looks. These moments of solidarity provide brief respite, but the pressure of performance remains relentless. Once the children are safely at school, the day's work is far from over. Single mothers in the 1950s often worked full-time jobs, earning wages that barely covered the household expenses. In the workplace, the challenges were different but no less daunting. Women faced strict social expectations, subtle and overt sexism, and a constant need to prove their competence. Attention to appearance, posture, and demeanor was scrutinized at every turn. Co-workers and bosses often dispensed unsolicited advice about everything from home management to personal life choices, reinforcing the notion that a woman's value was measured by her adherence to social norms rather than her skill or dedication. The office environment itself offered little relief. The clatter of typewriters, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the endless ring of telephones created a sense of urgency and constant pressure. Tasks piled up, memos required immediate attention, and interruptions were frequent. Yet, a single mother learned to navigate this demanding environment with quiet ingenuity, multitasking efficiently while maintaining composure. Each day was a delicate balancing act, managing professional responsibilities, household duties, and financial survival simultaneously. Lunch breaks offered small, precious windows of solidarity. In the break room, other working women shared practical tips, exchanged recipes designed to stretch limited ingredients, and commiserated over shared struggles. Conversations about grocery prices, rationing, and household management created a sense of community, however brief. In these moments, women reinforced each other's resilience, finding humor, resourcefulness, and comfort in collective experience. Yet, even in these small reprieves, the underlying tension of societal expectations lingered, a constant reminder that life was under scrutiny. The afternoon brought further challenges. School-aged children returned home, hungry and full of questions. Snacks needed to be prepared, homework supervised, and disputes mediated. Every household item, food, clothing, even a dog, was a potential source of chaos requiring immediate attention. Domestic life was not a series of discrete tasks but a continuous, overlapping cycle of responsibilities that demanded attention, flexibility, and ingenuity. A mother's ability to improvise, to adapt to unexpected crises, and to maintain order under pressure was tested every single day. Evenings were dominated by meals and household upkeep. Dinner required creativity and careful planning, transforming limited pantry ingredients into meals that were both filling and presentable. Each casserole or improvised dish represented not just nutrition, but also a display of competence, love, and resilience. Conversation at the table needed to balance the children's curiosity, their appetites, and their emotional well-being while subtly reinforcing social norms and expectations. After dinner, chores continued with washing dishes, tidying the home, and preparing for the next day. Every corner of the house was a testament to ongoing labor, effort, and the relentless pursuit of some semblance of order and normalcy. Throughout it all, emotional labor was constant. A single mother carried the weight of judgment, financial uncertainty, and social expectation, all while ensuring her children felt loved, secure, and supported. Yet, despite exhaustion and societal pressures, she exhibited remarkable resilience. She created a household where children could grow, learn, and thrive, even when circumstances were far from ideal. Humor, creativity, and resourcefulness were essential tools, allowing her to transform daily struggles into small victories that ensured her family's survival and well-being. In reflecting on the lives of single mothers in the 1950s, it becomes clear that these women navigated a world built for duets, performing solo under intense scrutiny and with limited resources. Their experiences highlight not only the challenges of domestic life, employment, and social expectation but also the extraordinary strength and ingenuity required to sustain a household in the face of adversity. It is a story of quiet heroism, of resilience hidden behind ordinary tasks, and of determination that turned scarcity and judgment into acts of care, love, and survival. So, as we step back into our own time, it is worth pausing to acknowledge the courage and resourcefulness of these women. They shaped their children's lives, their communities, and, in subtle ways, the broader cultural landscape of post-war America. And while the world may have judged them harshly, they carried on with dignity, humor, and creativity, teaching lessons that remain relevant today. That strength often goes unseen, that resourcefulness can turn scarcity into sustenance, and that the small, everyday acts of care are often the most heroic of all. In this journey through a 1950s Single Mother's Day, we have glimpsed a life defined by resilience, creativity, and determination. From the moment the coffee is poured to the final dish washed before bed, every action is an act of love, every choice a calculated effort to navigate a world that did not fully understand or support her. It is a life that required constant improvisation, careful balancing, and an unwavering commitment to her family. And though times have changed, the lessons of these women about perseverance, ingenuity, and quiet strength remain timeless, offering inspiration to anyone navigating challenges, then or now. In the 1950s, being a single mother was far more than a personal circumstance, it was a social verdict. While today, conversations around single parenthood are more understanding and inclusive, back then, societal norms were rigid, unforgiving, and often cruel. To be a woman raising children alone in that decade was to navigate a labyrinth of scrutiny, judgment, and constant social pressure. These mothers were often labeled harshly, seen as failures, morally suspect, or irresponsible regardless of the circumstances that had brought them into single parenthood. The stigma was not just whispered behind closed doors. It permeated schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and even extended families, creating a pervasive sense of isolation and the constant need to defend one's choices, even silently. Imagine a small suburban town where everyone knows everyone else's business. The school playground becomes a stage for judgment. Mothers are observed not only for how they dress their children but for the behavior, manners, and appearance of those children. A child with untidy hair, mismatched socks, or an unwashed coat could reflect back on the mother as proof of her alleged incompetence. Teachers, neighbors, and other parents often assumed the worst, making single mothers hyper-aware that their private struggles were, in fact, public spectacle. This relentless social gaze forced mothers to perform perfection daily, masking exhaustion, financial strain, and emotional turmoil behind polite smiles and carefully curated appearances. The workplace was another arena where judgment weighed heavily. Employers often held prejudices against women raising children alone, questioning their dedication, reliability, or moral character. A single mother might face subtle discrimination, being passed over for promotions, excluded from social gatherings with colleagues, or subjected to intrusive questions about her personal life. Women often had to work harder than their peers, proving competence while enduring scrutiny that their married colleagues rarely experienced. Even small mistakes could be amplified, reinforcing stereotypes and making the professional world an additional source of stress and anxiety. Family, which might have been expected to provide support, was often a complicated space. Some mothers were abandoned, some were disowned, and others faced criticism from relatives who feared social embarrassment or felt that single motherhood reflected poorly on the family's reputation. Advice and assistance were frequently accompanied by judgment or resentment, leaving mothers to balance gratitude and necessity against the sting of constant criticism. They learned to navigate these interactions carefully, showing respect while simultaneously protecting their autonomy and dignity. Community and religious institutions, which were meant to offer guidance and care, often became instruments of judgment. Churches, community organizations, and charitable groups sometimes treated single mothers with suspicion, emphasizing moral expectations and using sermons or advice to reinforce social norms that marginalized women raising children alone. Mothers could attend events, participate in programs, and seek assistance, but always with the unspoken understanding that their personal circumstances were a mark against them. In many cases, this scrutiny led to feelings of shame and social invisibility, as mothers internalized society's negative views and struggled to assert their worth. Even in casual social encounters, single mothers faced subtle yet constant reminders of their outsider status. A neighbor's comment about good girls who marry before having children, a whispered suggestion at the grocery store, or the exaggerated interest of a stranger in a mother's situation all served to reinforce the stigma. These interactions, though seemingly minor, accumulated over time, creating a pervasive sense of vulnerability and self-consciousness. Mothers became experts in managing appearances, rehearsing social scripts, and strategically navigating public spaces to avoid conflict or judgment. Children, too, were not immune to the effects of societal stigma. They often absorbed, in small ways, the shame projected onto their mothers. They might hear teasing at school, experience exclusion from peer groups, or sense the tension when neighbors whispered or stared. Mothers had to shield their children from both overt criticism and subtle social cues, working tirelessly to create a sense of normalcy and security in a world that constantly questioned their family's legitimacy. This dual responsibility, managing both external judgment and the emotional well-being of their children, placed enormous psychological pressure on single mothers. Financial limitations added another layer to the social stigma. Poverty, often unavoidable for single mothers, was seen not just as a practical challenge but as a moral failing. Neighbors, relatives, and even strangers equated financial struggle with irresponsibility or lack of character, ignoring the systemic barriers and lack of support that made economic survival so difficult. Mothers often had to stretch every dollar, making sacrifices and inventive solutions to maintain the appearance of stability and competence. Every budget-friendly meal, thrifted coat, or handmade birthday gift was both a triumph and a carefully hidden necessity that masked the deeper reality of hardship. Despite these pressures, single mothers in the 1950s developed remarkable resilience and resourcefulness. Many created networks of support with other women who understood the same challenges, sharing advice, childcare, meals, and emotional support. They learned to anticipate judgment, preempt criticism, and develop strategies to maintain dignity and control over their lives. Humor, creativity, and determination became essential tools not just for survival but for resisting the oppressive social norms that sought to define and limit them. Even in the face of widespread stigma, these women claimed their place in society. They were teachers, nurses, secretaries, homemakers, and businesswomen, often excelling despite the disadvantages imposed upon them. They found ways to provide stability, education, and emotional support to their children while maintaining employment and household management. Their achievements were not widely recognized, often overlooked in the historical record, but they were profoundly significant, shaping the lives of their children and, in subtle ways, contributing to gradual cultural shifts. In reflecting on the social stigma of the 1950s, it is clear that single mothers were navigating a world that demanded perfection, moral conformity, and invisibility, yet they persisted with courage and ingenuity. They redefined what it meant to be a mother, challenging societal expectations simply by raising their children with love, care, and resilience. Their stories remind us of the power of perseverance and the human capacity to endure, adapt, and thrive even in the most judgmental of environments. Understanding this context helps modern audiences appreciate the historical barriers single mothers faced and the social progress that has occurred since then. Yet it also offers timeless lessons that empathy, support, and understanding are essential, and that judgment, subtle or overt, can have profound impacts on families and communities. By examining the challenges of the past, we gain insight into the courage required to live authentically, to protect loved ones, and to navigate a society that may not always offer validation or understanding. In essence, the social stigma faced by single mothers in the 1950s was not just a background issue, it was a defining aspect of daily life, shaping every interaction, decision, and effort. From the playground to the workplace, the neighborhood street to the family dinner table, judgment was constant, and resilience was essential. These women demonstrated incredible strength, often invisible to the public eye, providing lessons that remain deeply relevant today. They remind us that dignity, perseverance, and love can flourish even in the face of relentless societal pressure, and that history is filled with quiet, heroic figures whose stories deserve to be told, honored, and remembered. In the mid-20th century, the world of child rearing was not only governed by social norms but also heavily influenced by the medical establishment. Pediatricians, psychologists, and various specialists often assumed the role of moral and behavioral arbiters, advising parents on what was normal and what needed correction. For single mothers, already under social scrutiny, these medical recommendations carried immense weight, creating an additional layer of pressure and anxiety. The idea that a child's behavior or temperament could reflect on the mother's moral character fueled a growing reliance on medical interventions aimed at shaping, controlling, or normalizing children in accordance with societal expectations. Doctors and specialists frequently recommended sedatives, tonics, or other medications to manage children's behavior, often without fully considering the long-term implications. These recommendations were framed as a way to help children conform to quiet a restless child in a classroom, to calm a child's anxiety at home, or to ensure better sleep patterns. Parents were told that compliance with these interventions was in the best interest of their child's development. Yet, beneath this veneer of medical guidance was a subtle coercion. Mothers were made to feel responsible for any behavioral deviation, and failure to follow medical advice could be interpreted as neglect or incompetence. Schools also played a role in reinforcing the medicalization of childhood. Teachers and school administrators, observing children in structured environments, were quick to identify problematic behaviors, fidgeting, shyness, or occasional defiance as signs of underlying issues needing correction. Recommendations for evaluation by medical professionals often followed, and mothers were pressured to comply in order to avoid accusations of failing in their parental duties. What might have once been considered normal childhood energy or personality traits became medicalized, pathologized, and subject to intervention. Pharmaceutical companies, seizing on this climate of concern and authority, marketed products that promised easier, more manageable children. Tonics, syrups, and early sedatives were advertised as solutions to sleepless nights, fussy behavior, or restlessness, often implying that responsible mothers would use them to ensure their children's well-being. The language of marketing played on maternal anxiety, suggesting that failure to provide these interventions could harm the child's development or the family's social standing. Mothers, seeking to do the best for their children, were drawn into this web of medical and commercial influence. Medical interventions were not always harmless or effective. Dosages were sometimes excessive, side effects poorly understood, and long-term consequences largely unknown. Children experienced drowsiness, slowed development, and other unexpected reactions, leaving mothers to grapple with guilt and uncertainty. They had placed their trust in professionals, only to discover that the very tools meant to help might have caused harm. Yet the pressure to conform to adhere to professional recommendations, to maintain appearances, and to protect the child's future often outweighed personal doubts or hesitations. The cultural context amplified this dynamic. In a society where single motherhood was stigmatized and children were seen as reflections of parental character, medical authority became a double-edged sword. Compliance with a doctor's advice offered a form of validation, a shield against criticism, and a path toward social acceptance. Refusal or skepticism, by contrast, could reinforce judgment from family, neighbors, and educators. Mothers were trapped in a delicate balance, negotiating between medical guidance, social expectation, and their own instincts and moral compass. Psychological theories of the time also contributed to this pressure. Concepts of emotional stability, personality development, and intelligence were often intertwined with moral judgment, implying that deviations from the expected standard were evidence of parental failure. Mothers were urged to consult specialists, to follow treatment plans, and to manage their children's emotions and behavior meticulously. The line between medical advice and social coercion blurred, leaving parents vulnerable to both professional authority and societal scrutiny. In many cases, interventions extended beyond medication. Behavioral therapies, strict routines, and regimented schedules were recommended to enforce conformity. Children were often expected to adhere to standards that prioritized obedience, calmness, and predictability, with little room for individuality or natural temperament. For mothers, implementing these strategies was both time-consuming and emotionally taxing, requiring constant vigilance, discipline, and negotiation. Yet the stakes were high. Any perceived failure could be interpreted as evidence of maternal inadequacy. The stories of these mothers and their children reveal the human cost of these interventions. While some children benefited from guidance and structured support, others experienced stress, confusion, and a sense of being controlled rather than nurtured. Mothers, navigating a world that judged them harshly, often internalized guilt and doubt. They questioned their choices, their judgment, and their ability to provide the best care. Every decision carried weight not just for the child's immediate well-being, but for the family's reputation and the mother's social standing. Despite the challenges, many mothers exercised remarkable discernment and advocacy. Some questioned the necessity of medications, adjusted routines to suit their child's temperament, and sought alternative strategies when conventional advice seemed harsh or harmful. They became advocates for their children in a system that often prioritized conformity over individual needs. This advocacy required courage, resilience, and a willingness to resist authority in small but significant ways, demonstrating a profound commitment to their child's welfare. Looking back, the medicalization of childhood in the 1950s highlights the intersection of science, culture, and social expectation. Mothers were caught between genuine concern for their children, the persuasive authority of professionals, and the unrelenting pressure of a judgmental society. The lessons of this era resonate today: the importance of informed consent, the recognition of parental intuition, and the need to balance professional guidance with empathy and individualized care. In the end, the story of medical interventions and the pressure to normalize children is a story about power, responsibility, and resilience. It shows how mothers navigated complex systems, made difficult choices under scrutiny, and strove to protect and nurture their children despite uncertainty and societal pressure. Their experiences remind us of the profound influence that medical, social, and cultural forces can have on family life and the remarkable strength of those who lived through it, finding ways to persevere, advocate, and care in a world that often misunderstood or judged them. As the mid-20th century unfolded, the use of sedatives and tonics on children became increasingly common, often viewed as a convenient solution to restless behavior, sleepless nights, or emotional distress. At first glance, these medications seemed harmless, even beneficial, a way to calm an anxious child, to ensure a family could rest, or to meet societal expectations of a well-behaved child. Yet behind the seemingly benign purpose lay consequences that were subtle, pervasive, and often overlooked. Children exposed to sedatives frequently displayed immediate effects: drowsiness, lethargy, or temporary calm. Parents, particularly single mothers already under intense social scrutiny, could find relief in these brief moments of quiet. It seemed as if the medicine were doing exactly what it was intended to do, allowing routines to proceed more smoothly and providing a sense of control in a world that often felt unpredictable. But these surface-level effects masked deeper, long-term repercussions, many of which were only discovered decades later. One of the most profound hidden consequences was the impact on cognitive and emotional development. Children's brains, particularly in the early years, are remarkably sensitive to chemical influences. Sedatives, while reducing immediate agitation or restlessness, could interfere with neural pathways, affecting attention, memory, and emotional regulation. Children might become more passive or withdrawn, losing the spontaneity and curiosity that are crucial to healthy development. At the same time, they could experience mood swings or unpredictable behavior once the sedative effects wore off, creating a cycle of dependency on medication to maintain emotional stability. Beyond the neurological effects, there were social and psychological consequences. Children medicated to conform to behavioral norms often struggled with self-expression. When natural energy or temperament was suppressed by medication, children learned to internalize frustration and anxiety rather than articulate it. This could lead to feelings of inadequacy, low self-esteem, or confusion about why their bodies and minds reacted differently from those of their peers. In many cases, these children grew up questioning their own sense of normalcy, unaware that the interventions meant to help them had subtly altered their developmental trajectory. The influence of sedatives also extended into the parent-child relationship. Mothers, believing they were doing the best for their children, often administered medications with care and concern. Yet the very act of medicating could unintentionally create distance or tension. Children might associate affection with the administration of medicine or become dependent on it to navigate emotions, rather than learning to cope naturally with challenges. Mothers, meanwhile, could experience guilt or doubt, torn between the advice of professionals, their own instincts, and the observable effects of the medication. This tension often lingered long after the immediate purpose of the medication had passed. In some cases, the consequences were tragically severe. Overdoses, accidental misuse, or cumulative effects of repeated doses could lead to serious health complications, hospitalizations, or developmental delays. The medical community at the time, still exploring the pharmacology of these drugs, did not fully understand the risks. Parents were often left with little guidance, navigating unknown hazards with hope rather than certainty. The very interventions intended to protect children could, inadvertently, place them at risk. The broader societal context amplified these hidden consequences. Teachers, neighbors, and extended family members, seeing calm, compliant children, often reinforced the idea that medication was effective and necessary. Mothers received approval for compliance, while those who questioned or resisted medical advice risked judgment or criticism. This external validation reinforced reliance on sedatives, even when subtle warning signs emerged, creating a feedback loop in which both children and parents were constrained by societal expectations and medical authority. Over time, researchers began to study the long-term outcomes of childhood exposure to sedatives. They found correlations with attention deficits, mood disorders, and difficulties in social adaptation. While not all children were affected equally, patterns emerged that highlighted the importance of careful oversight and awareness of potential consequences. These findings prompted a gradual reevaluation of the widespread use of such medications and sparked conversations about ethical responsibility, informed consent, and the necessity of balancing immediate convenience against long-term well-being. The hidden consequences were not limited to individual health. They rippled through families and communities. Siblings observed the effects, sometimes internalizing fear or anxiety about their own behavior. Schools and social environments, focused on conformity and outward calm, failed to recognize that compliance under sedation was not equivalent to emotional or cognitive health. Communities, unknowingly, reinforced a system in which children were medicated to fit expectations, rather than supported to thrive naturally. Mothers, reflecting on these experiences years later, often expressed mixed emotions. They had acted in good faith, relying on professionals and societal guidance. Yet the outcomes, for some children, revealed the unintended costs of well-intentioned interventions. These reflections serve as a powerful reminder of the complexity of parenting within a medicalized and socially prescriptive environment. They underscore the necessity of vigilance, questioning, and advocacy, even when advice comes from authoritative sources. In examining this era, one cannot ignore the lessons for contemporary society. The story of sedative use in children highlights the importance of understanding not only immediate outcomes but also long-term consequences. It calls attention to the delicate balance between medical guidance and parental intuition, between societal norms and individual needs. Perhaps most importantly, it emphasizes that interventions, no matter how well-intentioned, must be approached with caution, informed awareness, and continuous evaluation. Ultimately, the hidden consequences of sedative use reveal a layered and complex reality. Children were often caught between care and control, love and coercion, guidance and manipulation. Mothers navigated these challenges with resilience, striving to protect their children in a world that offered little certainty. The stories remind us that the path to well-being is rarely straightforward and that vigilance, empathy, and understanding are essential in safeguarding the physical, emotional, and cognitive health of children. Through these narratives, we gain insight into the human experience of medical interventions, the good intentions, the unforeseen outcomes, and the enduring resilience of those who lived through them. By reflecting on these hidden consequences, we not only honor the experiences of mothers and children but also strengthen our awareness of the ethical, psychological, and social dimensions that continue to shape the care of children today. The story of sedative use in children is not complete without examining the role of medical professionals, whose decisions, guidance, and authority shaped the lives of countless families. In the mid-20th century, doctors were often viewed as ultimate arbiters of health, and their recommendations carried immense weight. Parents, especially mothers, relied heavily on medical expertise, trusting that prescribed medications were safe, effective, and in the child's best interest. Yet the reality was far more complex, revealing both the power and the responsibility inherent in medical authority. Medical professionals, navigating a rapidly evolving field of pharmacology, were working with limited data. Sedatives, tranquilizers, and tonics were frequently marketed as safe for children, and scientific understanding of long-term impacts was still in its infancy. Physicians, aiming to alleviate suffering and provide practical solutions for families, often prescribed these medications with confidence, assuming that short-term calm would translate into overall benefit. In many cases, this confidence was reinforced by societal norms. Children were expected to be compliant, families were expected to maintain order, and deviations from these expectations were often framed as behavioral issues requiring intervention. The prescribing practices of the time reflected a delicate balance between intention and consequence. Doctors were motivated by care, compassion, and a desire to solve pressing problems. Yet, in the absence of rigorous studies on pediatric pharmacology, these decisions sometimes had unforeseen repercussions. Sedatives might calm a child temporarily, but they could also interfere with emotional expression, cognitive development, or long-term well-being. The very expertise that inspired trust could inadvertently contribute to outcomes that families were unprepared to manage. One of the most challenging aspects of the medical professional's role was communication. Parents were often given instructions that emphasized dosage, frequency, and immediate effects, but less attention was paid to long-term monitoring or potential developmental consequences. Mothers, following directions diligently, could unknowingly place their children at risk simply by adhering to medical guidance. The responsibility of the doctor extended beyond the act of prescribing. It encompassed education, ongoing observation, and ethical reflection tasks that were not always fully realized in practice. The issue of responsibility is further complicated by the social dynamics of the time. Single mothers, in particular, faced intense scrutiny and pressure to demonstrate competence. When a doctor recommended medication, It was often not just medical advice, it was validation, a form of social approval that reassured mothers they were doing the right thing. Conversely, questioning or refusing medical guidance could invite criticism or judgment, both from professionals and the broader community. In this environment, the power of the physician was magnified, intertwining medical authority with social influence in ways that deeply affected family decisions and child outcomes. Medical professionals were also navigating an ethical landscape that was still developing. Pediatric medicine was evolving, and the long-term ethical considerations of medicating children for behavioral compliance were not yet widely debated. The decisions made in clinics and offices reflected prevailing medical paradigms, commercial influences, and cultural expectations, rather than a fully informed understanding of ethical responsibility toward the child. Physicians operated within constraints, sometimes prioritizing immediate relief over potential future consequences, and their authority could overshadow parental intuition or concern. In hindsight, the role of medical professionals illustrates both the promise and peril of expertise. Doctors had the power to provide care and comfort, to offer solutions where families felt helpless. Yet with that power came immense responsibility, and in many cases, the long-term effects on children revealed gaps in understanding, communication, and ethical oversight. These gaps underscore the need for vigilance, humility, and continuous learning in medical practice, principles that remain relevant today. Professional accountability extended beyond the individual doctor. Medical boards, pharmaceutical companies, and educational institutions all played a role in shaping the use of sedatives in children. Marketing materials, training programs, and prevailing medical literature reinforced the perception of safety and efficacy. Physicians operated within a system that often emphasized compliance, calm behavior, and immediate symptom relief, sometimes at the expense of holistic understanding. This structural context highlights the complex interplay between individual responsibility and systemic influence, reminding us that the consequences of medical decisions are rarely confined to a single interaction. Parents, reflecting on their experiences decades later, often grappled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. They trusted their physicians, believing in the authority of professional guidance, yet some recognized that these decisions carried unintended consequences for their children's development and emotional health. These reflections are not indictments but rather invitations to examine the broader dynamics at play. The interplay of trust, authority, social pressure, and evolving scientific knowledge. They illustrate how the actions of medical professionals ripple through families and communities, shaping outcomes in ways that are sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, and always significant. Importantly, the narrative of medical responsibility emphasizes the need for informed consent and ongoing education. Families must understand not only the immediate effects of medication but also potential long-term implications. Doctors must recognize the profound influence they hold and approach pediatric prescribing with both scientific rigor and ethical sensitivity. The story of sedative use in children serves as a cautionary tale, reminding contemporary society that good intentions must be coupled with knowledge, reflection, and accountability. In looking back, the historical use of sedatives highlights a critical lesson. Medical expertise is not solely about prescribing solutions. It is about understanding context, consequences, and the human beings whose lives are affected. Doctors were navigating uncertainty, but their actions carried weighty implications, shaping childhood experiences and, in many cases, long-term developmental trajectories. Recognizing the responsibility inherent in medical authority allows us to appreciate the delicate balance between care and oversight, between immediate benefit and long-term welfare. Ultimately, examining the role of medical professionals in this context sheds light on the ethical, social, and practical dimensions of pediatric care. It prompts reflection on how knowledge, authority, and compassion intersect, and how each decision, however well-intentioned, can leave lasting marks on children and families. By studying this history, we gain insight not only into past practices but also into the enduring principles that must guide medical care today: responsibility, transparency, and an unwavering focus on the well-being of the child. The narrative of sedative use, intertwined with the role of physicians, challenges us to think critically about trust, expertise, and ethical responsibility. It reminds us that the choices made in the name of care carry consequences, some immediate and visible, others hidden and unfolding over time. It is a call to honor the trust placed in medical professionals while ensuring that power is exercised with wisdom, foresight, and compassion, a lesson as relevant now as it was decades ago. Understanding the history of sedative use in children requires us to look not only at doctors and medications but also at the societal pressures placed upon mothers. In the mid-20th century, the role of women, particularly mothers, was framed by strict cultural expectations. Women were often seen as the primary caretakers, responsible for the emotional and physical well-being of their children, while also maintaining the home and navigating social judgment. These pressures created an environment in which the use of sedatives was not merely a medical decision, it became a social imperative, a means of meeting expectations and managing scrutiny. Mothers faced a constant balancing act. They were expected to nurture, discipline, and educate, all while maintaining a household that reflected societal ideals of order and propriety. A child who was restless, fussy, or non-compliant was not only a source of personal stress but also a potential mark of failure in the eyes of neighbors, relatives, and community members. Within this framework, the use of sedatives could be perceived as a practical solution, a way to fulfill social duties without resorting to harsher disciplinary measures. Mothers, often isolated and carrying the weight of responsibility alone, sometimes found that medical guidance offered both relief and validation. The societal expectation for calm, obedient children placed mothers in an almost impossible position. They were judged not only by the behavior of their children but also by how they managed that behavior. The pressure to maintain appearances could lead to difficult choices, especially when recommended solutions were sanctioned by medical professionals. A doctor's prescription became more than a medical tool. It was a socially endorsed strategy to ensure that mothers could meet communal expectations while managing the daily demands of childcare. Single mothers, in particular, experienced heightened pressure. In communities that valued traditional family structures, single mothers often faced scrutiny, stigma, and judgment. The prescription of sedatives offered a way to demonstrate competence and control, a method of aligning with societal norms even in circumstances that made such alignment challenging. For these women, following medical advice was not simply a question of health, it was a form of social protection, a way to shield themselves from criticism while caring for their children as best they could. It is important to recognize that these pressures were amplified by the lack of alternative support systems. Childcare resources, mental health services, and educational guidance were limited, especially for mothers without partners or extended family support. The combination of isolation, judgment, and expectation created a situation in which the use of sedatives could seem like the most reasonable option. Mothers were navigating a world that demanded both perfection and compliance, and in the absence of systemic support, medication often became a coping mechanism not just for children, but for the mothers themselves. Cultural narratives of motherhood played a significant role in shaping these decisions. Literature, media, and social norms celebrated the ideal mother, calm, patient, nurturing, and in control. A child's misbehavior was often interpreted as a reflection of maternal inadequacy, not merely natural development. Within this cultural lens, the use of sedatives could appear both rational and responsible. Mothers could claim that they were acting in the best interest of their child while simultaneously meeting societal expectations of competence and care. These pressures were further reinforced by peer networks and community judgment. Advice from friends, relatives, and neighbors often echoed medical recommendations, creating an environment in which the use of sedatives became normalized. Mothers were navigating conflicting demands, to be nurturing yet authoritative, compassionate yet practical. The perception that medication could help achieve this balance reinforced its widespread use, even when long-term effects were unknown. Emotional labor played a central role in these dynamics. Mothers were expected to manage not only the behavior of their children but also their own stress, fatigue, and anxiety, all while projecting competence and calm. The prescription of sedatives offered a temporary reprieve, a way to manage the relentless demands of daily life. It is crucial to understand that these decisions were rarely made lightly. They were informed by love, concern, and a desire to protect the child, even as they were shaped by social expectation and pressure. Examining these societal pressures also sheds light on the gendered nature of responsibility. Fathers, when present, were often less scrutinized for their involvement or lack thereof in managing children's behavior. Mothers, on the other hand, bore the brunt of social judgment, navigating both public perception and personal guilt. The prescription of sedatives can therefore be seen as a response not only to the child's needs but also to a social environment that demanded maternal perfection, often without recognizing the systemic constraints mothers faced. Importantly, the narrative of societal pressure highlights the intersection of culture, gender, and medicine. Mothers were not merely passive recipients of medical advice, they were negotiating complex social dynamics, making decisions under scrutiny, and managing the well-being of their children within a framework that often offered little support or understanding. The use of sedatives was entwined with these pressures, reflecting broader societal expectations as much as individual family circumstances. In reflecting on this history, we gain insight into the profound impact of cultural norms on medical decision-making. Mothers acted with care, love, and concern, but their choices were shaped by a society that demanded control, order, and compliance. The story of sedative use in children is therefore inseparable from the story of motherhood itself, a narrative of responsibility, judgment, and the often overlooked emotional labor that defined women's lives. Understanding this context allows us to see that the historical use of sedatives was not simply a medical phenomenon. It was a social one. Mothers, navigating complex expectations, made decisions that reflected both personal concern and societal pressure. The consequences of these choices, sometimes beneficial, sometimes harmful, illuminate the challenges of parenting in a world that demanded perfection, obedience, and calm, while offering limited support or understanding. Ultimately, examining societal pressures on mothers teaches us about the intricate interplay of gender, culture, and medicine. It reminds us that decisions about children's well-being do not occur in a vacuum. They are influenced by social norms, medical authority, and the expectations placed upon caregivers. By acknowledging these pressures, we gain a more complete understanding of historical practices and the human experiences that shaped them, allowing us to reflect on how society can better support families and children today. As we move deeper into the history of sedative use in children, it becomes clear that the story is not only about mothers and societal pressures, it is also about the medical professionals who prescribed these medications, and the ethical debates that emerged within the medical community at the time. The mid-20th century was a period of rapid development in pharmacology, with new drugs and treatments becoming widely available, often before long-term effects were fully understood. Doctors faced difficult decisions, balancing their desire to alleviate immediate distress in children with the uncertainty of long-term outcomes. Medical ethics in this era were evolving, and pediatric care was still a developing field. Physicians were guided by the principles of beneficence, acting in the best interest of the patient, but were often challenged by the lack of rigorous clinical evidence on the effects of sedatives in young children. Some doctors believed that calming a restless or hyperactive child with medication was a compassionate act, reducing immediate suffering for both the child and the parents. Others raised concerns about the potential for dependency, delayed development, or unintended side effects, questioning whether the convenience of sedation outweighed the risks. Debates within the medical community were often framed around both science and morality. Some physicians emphasized the importance of parental guidance and social context, recognizing that families faced real pressures and challenges in managing children's behavior. Others focused strictly on the medical dimension, questioning whether it was ethical to administer drugs to children whose behavior was within the range of normal development, simply to meet social expectations or ease parental burden. These debates highlighted a tension between the human desire to provide immediate relief and the responsibility to consider long-term consequences. A particularly difficult ethical question revolved around consent and autonomy. Children, especially infants and toddlers, could not voice their preferences or understand the implications of treatment. Parents, acting as proxies, were making decisions on behalf of their children, often with incomplete information. Doctors were aware of this dynamic and sometimes struggled with the moral weight of prescribing sedatives without clear evidence of benefit, knowing that their actions could have lasting effects. The question was no longer just whether a medication worked in the short term, it became whether it was right to use it at all, given the limited understanding of potential harm. Within hospitals and clinics, differing opinions among colleagues often led to heated discussions. Some pediatricians advocated for minimal intervention, suggesting that behavioral issues could be addressed through non-pharmacological methods, including structured routines, play therapy, and parental guidance. Others defended the use of sedatives, arguing that modern medicine should alleviate suffering wherever possible, and that the child's immediate comfort was a valid priority. These discussions were not merely academic, they influenced prescribing practices, shaped medical literature, and guided the advice offered to parents navigating these difficult decisions. The ethical debates extended beyond individual doctors to professional organizations and medical journals. Articles appeared discussing the moral implications of sedative use, questioning whether physicians were prioritizing parental convenience over child welfare, and debating the line between therapeutic treatment and social engineering. Some voices warned against normalizing the sedation of children as a solution to behavioral challenges, emphasizing that medicine should not be used to enforce conformity or suppress natural development. Others framed the discussion around compassion and practicality, highlighting the real-world challenges faced by families and the potential benefits of carefully monitored medication. These debates were complicated by the evolving understanding of child psychology. As research into developmental stages and behavioral disorders advanced, some doctors began to recognize that children's restlessness or irritability could have multiple causes: biological, emotional, and environmental. This nuanced understanding prompted further ethical reflection. Should sedatives be used as a first-line response, or only after alternative strategies were attempted? And even when medications were prescribed, what safeguards were necessary to ensure that the child's well-being remained the primary concern? Economic and social factors also influenced ethical decision-making. In communities with limited access to childcare resources or parental support, doctors sometimes faced a dilemma. Prescribing medication could be seen as a practical solution to a larger social problem, relieving parental stress and preventing potential neglect or accidents. Yet this pragmatic approach raised further questions about the appropriate role of medicine in society. Should doctors intervene to compensate for social deficiencies, or should their responsibility remain strictly medical? These dilemmas reflected the complexity of ethical practice in real-world settings, where the ideal and the practical often collided. Some physicians also grappled with the potential for unintended consequences. Reports of over-sedation, dependency, or developmental delays prompted reflection on the moral responsibility of the medical profession. While some doctors defended their practices as compassionate, Others began advocating for stricter guidelines, more research, and increased oversight. These discussions laid the groundwork for modern pediatric ethics, highlighting the importance of evidence-based practice, informed consent, and careful consideration of long-term outcomes. The ethical debates were not static. They evolved alongside medical knowledge, societal norms, and cultural expectations. What was considered acceptable in one decade could be questioned in the next as new research emerged and public awareness increased. Physicians who had once relied on sedation as a standard practice found themselves reconsidering their choices in light of evolving ethical standards, parental advocacy, and emerging data on child development. This dynamic environment underscores that medical ethics is not a fixed set of rules but a living conversation, shaped by science, culture, and the lived experiences of both doctors and families. Ultimately, the ethical questions surrounding sedative use in children remind us that medicine exists within a broader moral and social framework. Doctors were not operating in isolation, they were influenced by cultural norms, parental expectations, and the pressures of daily practice. The debates among medical professionals highlight the complexity of ethical decision-making, where scientific uncertainty, human emotion, and societal pressures intersect. These historical discussions continue to inform modern pediatrics, emphasizing the need for caution, empathy, and critical reflection in every decision that affects a child's life. Understanding these debates allows us to see the human dimension of medical history. Physicians acted with care and intent, yet faced profound moral dilemmas. Their decisions were informed not only by knowledge but also by uncertainty, context, and the weight of responsibility. By examining these ethical discussions, we gain insight into the challenges of pediatric medicine, the evolution of professional standards, and the enduring importance of considering both short-term relief and long-term well-being in every treatment decision. In reflecting on this history, it becomes clear that the story of sedative use in children is not simply about drugs or behavior, it is about the moral responsibilities of caregivers, the evolving nature of medical ethics, and the complex interplay between science, society, and culture. These ethical debates provide a lens through which we can understand past practices, learn from their limitations, and strive to create a more informed, compassionate approach to child care in the future. As we continue exploring the history of sedative use in children, it is impossible to separate medical practices from the broader societal and cultural forces at play. In the mid-20th century, family life, gender roles, and expectations of children were shaped by powerful cultural norms that exerted immense pressure on both parents and medical professionals. These pressures played a significant role in the widespread acceptance and use of sedatives, influencing decisions that went far beyond individual families and physicians. At the heart of these pressures were prevailing ideas about childhood behavior. In many societies, children were expected to be calm, obedient, and quiet, particularly in middle and upper-class households. Any deviation from these norms, such as restlessness, excessive crying, or difficulty sleeping, was often interpreted not as a natural variation in development, but as a problem to be corrected. Mothers, in particular, were held responsible for ensuring that their children conformed to societal standards, and failure to do so could result in judgment or social stigma. In this context, sedatives were sometimes viewed as a practical tool to maintain order and meet expectations, offering a solution that could quiet a restless child and restore a sense of control. The pressures extended beyond the home. Schools, daycare centers, and social institutions often reinforced similar ideals of behavior. Children who were hyperactive or difficult to manage could be labeled as problematic, and parents felt compelled to seek medical interventions to prevent future social or educational difficulties. This created a cycle in which social expectations directly influenced medical decisions. Parents sought help from doctors not merely for the child's immediate comfort, but to conform to societal norms and avoid criticism from teachers, neighbors, or relatives. Doctors, in turn, responded to these demands, sometimes prescribing sedatives as a way to assist families in meeting the cultural ideal of disciplined, manageable children. Cultural attitudes toward motherhood also shaped these decisions. Women were expected to manage the household, care for children, and maintain a composed, cheerful demeanor. Exhaustion, stress, or frustration could be perceived as a personal failure, and many mothers turned to medical advice or sedatives to cope with the demands placed upon them. Doctors were aware of this dynamic, and while some approached it with empathy, others recognized that prescribing medication was sometimes a form of social compliance, helping families navigate cultural expectations rather than addressing a strictly medical need. The use of sedatives thus became entangled with gender roles, parenting norms, and societal judgments, reflecting broader cultural pressures that extended far beyond the individual child. Media and advertising further reinforced these pressures. Popular magazines, parenting books, and medical advertisements often presented idealized images of childhood and parenthood, emphasizing calm, well-behaved children and efficient, capable mothers. Pharmaceutical companies sometimes marketed sedatives directly to parents, framing their products as solutions to common challenges such as sleeplessness, irritability, or hyperactivity. These messages contributed to a perception that medication was a normal, even necessary, part of child rearing, embedding the practice into everyday life and further influencing doctors' prescribing habits. The cultural narrative suggested that medication could resolve what were often normal developmental behaviors, creating an environment in which sedatives became a socially acceptable tool rather than a purely medical intervention. Economic factors also intersected with cultural pressures. In households where both parents worked, managing children's behavior could be particularly challenging, and the time and resources required for close supervision or behavioral management were not always available. Sedatives offered a practical, if temporary, solution that could ease daily routines and reduce stress. In this sense, the use of medication was not only a reflection of cultural ideals but also a response to the economic realities and logistical challenges faced by families. Societal expectations about productivity, domestic management, and the appearance of well-behaved children created a context in which sedatives became a tool to navigate multiple pressures simultaneously. Peer and community influence cannot be overlooked. Parents often shared advice, observed the practices of neighbors, and sought validation from social networks. When sedatives were widely used or recommended by respected figures, the practice gained legitimacy and became normalized. Conversely, parents who questioned or resisted these interventions risked social criticism or feelings of inadequacy. In this way, cultural pressures extended beyond direct expectations to subtle forms of social reinforcement, shaping decisions in ways that were both powerful and difficult to resist. It is also important to recognize the role of professional authority in amplifying cultural pressures. When doctors endorsed or prescribed sedatives, they were not merely responding to individual requests, they were lending medical legitimacy to a culturally driven solution. This interplay between professional authority and societal expectation reinforced the normalization of sedative use, creating an environment in which questioning the practice required challenging both medical expertise and deeply ingrained social norms. Families, caught between these pressures, often felt they had little choice but to follow professional advice, even if they harbored private doubts or concerns. The societal and cultural pressures surrounding sedative use were further complicated by evolving understandings of childhood and family life. During the mid-20th century, psychology and child development research were gaining prominence, influencing how behavior was interpreted and managed. However, these emerging scientific perspectives coexisted with traditional expectations and practical concerns, creating tension between new knowledge and established cultural norms. Doctors and parents were navigating a complex landscape in which scientific guidance, cultural ideals, and social pressures intersected, and decisions about sedative use often reflected compromises among these competing influences. The long-term consequences of these pressures are evident in both medical history and social memory. Children who were sedated for convenience or social conformity sometimes experienced delayed development, dependency issues, or other unintended outcomes. Families, meanwhile, often faced feelings of guilt or regret when the realities of these interventions became apparent. At the societal level, the normalization of sedative use reflected broader patterns of managing childhood behavior through medical means, raising questions about how culture shapes medical practice and the ethical responsibilities of professionals and parents alike. Ultimately, understanding the societal and cultural pressures that influenced sedative use in children allows us to see the practice not as a simple medical decision, but as a reflection of complex historical, social, and cultural dynamics. These pressures shape the lives of children, the decisions of parents, and the practices of doctors, creating a context in which medication became a tool for navigating expectations rather than addressing strictly medical needs. By examining this history, we gain insight into the interplay between culture, society, and medicine, and we are reminded of the importance of questioning how social norms influence healthcare decisions. This historical perspective also provides lessons for contemporary parenting and medical practice. It underscores the need to critically evaluate societal expectations, to seek evidence-based guidance, and to prioritize the long-term well-being of children over convenience or conformity. The story of sedative use in children is a reminder that cultural pressures are powerful, but they can and should be balanced against careful consideration of ethical, developmental, and health-related factors. It invites reflection on how parents, caregivers, and medical professionals can support children in ways that respect their individuality, promote healthy development, and navigate societal expectations thoughtfully and responsibly. In reflecting on this chapter of medical and social history, it becomes clear that the choices made regarding sedatives were never merely personal or clinical. They were deeply embedded in cultural narratives about childhood, parenthood, and social order. Recognizing these pressures allows us to understand the broader forces that shaped behavior, decision-making, and medical practice, and it encourages ongoing dialogue about how society can best support children without resorting to solutions that compromise their long-term health and autonomy. The history of sedative use in children is, in this sense, a story not just of medicine, but of society itself, revealing the profound influence of cultural expectations on the most intimate aspects of family life. As we move deeper into the story of sedative use in children, it becomes clear that the medical community itself played a crucial role in shaping practices, policies, and perceptions. The history of sedatives in pediatric care is not only a tale of social pressures and parental concerns, it is also a story of how doctors, researchers, and medical institutions wrestled with evolving knowledge, competing opinions, and ethical questions. Understanding this context is essential, as it illuminates both the complexity of medical decision-making and the ways in which professional debates influenced children's lives. In the mid-20th century, sedatives were widely regarded as useful tools for managing a range of behaviors in children, from sleeplessness to restlessness and irritability. Many physicians believed that these medications could provide temporary relief for children and their families, allowing for more stable routines and calmer homes. At the same time, the medical literature began to reflect a growing awareness that such treatments were not without risk. Reports of side effects, dependency, and developmental consequences gradually entered professional discussions, sparking debate about the appropriate use of sedatives in pediatric populations. These debates were complex and multifaceted. On one side, some practitioners argued that sedatives were a practical and necessary part of pediatric care, particularly for children exhibiting extreme behavioral challenges or those with medical conditions that disrupted sleep or increased anxiety. They emphasized the immediate benefits, noting that families often experienced relief from stress and that children could maintain better routines and overall stability. In this view, sedatives were framed as a therapeutic tool that, when used judiciously, could improve the quality of life for both children and their caregivers. On the other side, a growing number of medical professionals began questioning the wisdom of widespread sedative use. Concerns centered on the long-term effects of medication on the developing brain, the potential for physical or psychological dependency, and the ethical implications of medicating children for convenience rather than medical necessity. Critics argued that behavioral issues might be better addressed through non-pharmacological means, such as structured routines, environmental adjustments, or behavioral therapy, rather than resorting to chemical interventions. These discussions highlighted a tension between short-term management and long-term outcomes, reflecting an emerging commitment to more cautious and evidence-based pediatric care. The debates were further complicated by limited scientific evidence. During this period, controlled studies on the safety and efficacy of sedatives in children were relatively rare. Much of the knowledge was based on anecdotal experience, case studies, or observations from small patient populations. This lack of rigorous data made it difficult for the medical community to reach consensus, and differing interpretations of the available evidence fueled disagreements. Physicians had to navigate a landscape in which professional judgment, personal experience, and societal expectations all influenced prescribing patterns, and where clear guidelines were often absent or inconsistent. Professional organizations played an important role in shaping these debates. Pediatric societies, medical boards, and conferences provided forums for discussion, the exchange of research findings, and the development of guidelines. Over time, these institutions began to issue more cautious recommendations, emphasizing careful assessment, minimal effective dosing, and regular monitoring when sedatives were prescribed to children. Such guidance reflected a growing recognition of the risks involved, as well as an evolving understanding of child development and the potential impact of pharmacological interventions on behavior, cognition, and emotional health. The debates also highlighted broader philosophical questions within medicine. Physicians wrestled with the balance between alleviating immediate distress and avoiding potential harm, considering the ethical responsibility to do no harm while also supporting families in need. This required careful judgment, clear communication, and an awareness of both scientific evidence and social context. In some cases, doctors faced criticism for prescribing too readily, while in others, families expressed frustration when medications were withheld or limited. The evolving medical understanding of sedatives thus intersected with ethical dilemmas, professional standards, and the realities of patient care, creating a dynamic and sometimes contentious discourse. As research progressed, the medical community began to uncover evidence of the physiological and psychological consequences of sedative use in children. Studies on dependency, cognitive effects, and behavioral changes provided compelling reasons for caution. This growing body of knowledge gradually influenced practice patterns, encouraging more selective prescribing and greater emphasis on alternative approaches. Doctors became increasingly aware that the sedatives previously considered benign tools could, in some cases, produce unintended and long-lasting effects. This awareness marked a turning point in pediatric care, reflecting a shift from routine, socially influenced prescribing to a more careful, individualized, and ethically guided approach. Medical debates also intersected with public awareness and parental advocacy. As information about the risks of sedatives became more widely available through books, articles, and media coverage, parents began to question the necessity and safety of these interventions. Some families sought second opinions, challenged prescriptions, or pursued alternative methods of managing behavior. The dialogue between physicians and parents evolved, reflecting both the dissemination of knowledge and the increasing role of informed consent. This interaction underscored the importance of transparency, education, and collaboration in medical decision-making, as families became active participants in evaluating risks and benefits. Throughout this period, the medical community's understanding of sedative use was shaped not only by clinical observations but also by broader cultural and societal changes. Shifts in parenting philosophy, evolving ideas about child development, and growing awareness of ethical considerations influenced how physicians interpreted evidence and made treatment decisions. Medicine did not operate in isolation. Professional judgment was always mediated by the social context, public perception, and the emerging scientific framework. The debates over sedatives thus reflected a complex interplay of knowledge, ethics, culture, and practice, highlighting the challenges inherent in pediatric care. By examining this history, we can see how the medical community's evolving understanding contributed to both the rise and decline of sedative use in children. Early enthusiasm, often shaped by social norms and limited evidence, gave way to caution and debate as knowledge expanded. Physicians grappled with questions of efficacy, safety, and morality, balancing immediate benefits against potential long-term harm. These professional discussions not only influenced prescribing patterns but also contributed to broader societal awareness of the implications of medicating children, laying the groundwork for modern standards of pediatric care. Ultimately, the story of medical debates about sedatives demonstrates the importance of continuous inquiry, critical evaluation, and ethical reflection in healthcare. It reminds us that medical practice is not static, and that ongoing research, dialogue, and scrutiny are essential to ensure that interventions are safe, effective, and aligned with the best interests of patients. The history of sedatives in children is a powerful example of how medicine evolves in response to evidence, ethical concerns, and societal expectations, and how professional discourse can shape the health and well-being of generations. Reflecting on this chapter in pediatric history, we can appreciate the challenges faced by doctors navigating uncertainty, societal pressure, and ethical dilemmas. We also recognize the value of scientific progress, transparency, and collaboration between families and healthcare providers. The debates surrounding sedative use remind us that thoughtful, informed, and compassionate medical practice requires constant vigilance, a commitment to evidence, and sensitivity to the social context in which care is delivered. In conclusion, the medical community's evolving understanding of sedative use in children was not a straightforward path. It involved experimentation, debate, and gradual learning, as physicians sought to balance immediate relief with long-term well-being. By studying this history, we gain insight into the complexities of medical decision-making, the influence of societal pressures, and the ethical responsibilities of healthcare providers. It is a story that emphasizes the interplay between knowledge, culture, and practice, and it provides enduring lessons for both medical professionals and families in navigating the care of children. As we move into the realm of government involvement, it becomes clear that the story of sedative use in children is not only a medical and social narrative but also one deeply intertwined with law, policy, and regulatory oversight. Governments, through their agencies and legislative bodies, play a critical role in shaping how medications are developed, prescribed, and monitored. In the case of sedatives for children, regulations and policies gradually emerged in response to growing awareness of risks, public concern, and evolving scientific knowledge. Understanding this dimension is essential because it illustrates how the interplay between policy and medicine can affect the lives of the most vulnerable children. In the early decades of widespread sedative use, regulatory frameworks were often limited. The approval, labeling, and monitoring of pharmaceutical products were less stringent than they are today, and oversight mechanisms were still developing. Many medications were marketed and prescribed based on limited evidence, and the particular vulnerabilities of children were frequently underestimated. This regulatory gap allowed for a degree of experimentation and routine prescribing that, in hindsight, carried significant risks. Without strong guidelines or enforcement, Physicians often relied on personal experience, professional advice, and anecdotal evidence to determine dosages and suitability for pediatric patients. As reports of side effects, dependency, and developmental concerns emerged, public scrutiny and medical research began to push governments toward more active involvement. Agencies responsible for public health recognized the need for clearer guidance on the use of sedatives in children. This led to the development of regulations concerning labeling, dosage recommendations, and age-specific warnings. Governments began to require pharmaceutical companies to provide more rigorous clinical evidence to support claims of safety and efficacy. These measures represented an effort to bridge the gap between scientific uncertainty and public safety, acknowledging that children are not simply small adults, but individuals whose physiology and development require careful consideration. Legislative actions also played a role in shaping medical practice. Laws were enacted to restrict the marketing of certain medications, especially those intended for pediatric use, and to ensure that prescribers had access to accurate information about potential risks. Policies were introduced to mandate reporting of adverse effects, encouraging both doctors and families to share information about unexpected outcomes. These reporting systems provided valuable data that informed future regulations and guidelines, creating a feedback loop between practice, observation, and policy. Over time, this process contributed to a more structured and evidence-driven approach to pediatric pharmacology. Government oversight extended beyond formal legislation and regulatory agencies to include advisory committees, professional guidelines, and public health campaigns. These entities reviewed research, assessed emerging risks, and issued recommendations aimed at minimizing harm while maintaining therapeutic benefit. For example, advisory panels often evaluated dosage standards for children, provided recommendations for alternative treatments, and suggested monitoring protocols to detect early signs of dependency or adverse reactions. Their work helped standardize practice across different regions and healthcare systems, reducing variability and promoting safer approaches to pediatric sedative use. The influence of government policies also intersected with broader societal concerns. As parents, advocacy groups, and media outlets raised awareness about potential harms, policymakers responded by tightening oversight and introducing more stringent regulations. This interaction between public concern and governmental action highlights the role of social pressure in shaping medical practice. In many cases, policy changes were reactive, prompted by high-profile reports or emerging evidence of harm. Yet, these responses were crucial in ensuring that children's safety became a priority in both medical decision-making and pharmaceutical development. International perspectives further illustrate the importance of regulation. Different countries adopted varied approaches to pediatric sedative use, reflecting differences in medical culture, regulatory philosophy, and societal attitudes. Some nations implemented strict limits on the prescription of certain drugs to children, while others relied more heavily on professional discretion. Comparative studies and cross-border discussions allowed governments to learn from each other's experiences, contributing to the gradual development of global standards. These efforts demonstrated the value of regulatory cooperation and knowledge exchange in protecting children from potential harm. Another key aspect of government involvement was the requirement for clinical trials and research specific to pediatric populations. Historically, children were often excluded from drug trials, leaving doctors with little reliable data about appropriate dosages or long-term effects. Recognizing this gap, policymakers began to mandate pediatric studies, ensuring that medications underwent rigorous testing before being widely prescribed to children. These regulations not only improved safety but also enhanced understanding of pharmacokinetics and developmental considerations, allowing physicians to make more informed decisions. Government policies also emphasized education and awareness. Public health initiatives aim to inform both medical professionals and families about the potential risks and benefits of sedatives. Guidance documents, pamphlets, and training programs help doctors stay up to date with the latest research, while information campaigns for parents encourage them to ask questions, seek alternatives, and monitor their children's response to medication. This dual focus on professional and public education reflected a comprehensive approach, recognizing that regulation alone was insufficient without informed participation from all stakeholders. Enforcement mechanisms were another critical component. Regulatory agencies were tasked not only with issuing guidelines but also with monitoring compliance. Inspections, audits, and sanctions ensured that pharmaceutical companies and healthcare providers adhered to legal and ethical standards. This oversight helped prevent misuse, encouraged accurate labeling, and reinforced the importance of evidence-based practice. Over time, the combination of regulation, education, and enforcement contributed to a more cautious and structured approach to pediatric sedative use. Ultimately, the role of government in shaping sedative use in children underscores the interconnectedness of science, policy, and ethics. By establishing regulations, monitoring practice, and promoting research and education, governments helped reduce risks and improve outcomes for children. These efforts complemented the evolving understanding within the medical community and the growing awareness among families, creating a multi-layered system of protection and guidance. The history of policy and regulation in this context demonstrates how oversight and governance can influence medical practice, safeguard vulnerable populations, and respond to emerging knowledge in a dynamic and responsible manner. Reflecting on this chapter, it is clear that governmental action was essential in transforming pediatric sedative use from a largely unregulated and variable practice into a more evidence-based and carefully monitored process. Policies, oversight, and public engagement work together to establish standards that prioritize safety, ethical responsibility, and long-term well-being. This historical perspective reminds us that medicine does not operate in isolation, and that societal, scientific, and regulatory forces all shape the care that children receive. In conclusion, examining the role of government regulations and policies highlights the profound impact of oversight on pediatric healthcare. Through legislation, advisory committees, clinical trial requirements, and public education, governments helped ensure that sedatives were used responsibly, safely, and in alignment with the best interests of children. This story serves as a powerful example of how policy can guide medical practice, protect vulnerable populations, and foster the responsible evolution of healthcare in response to scientific discovery and societal concern. As we continue to explore the multifaceted history of sedative use in children, it becomes evident that the role of public awareness, media, and advocacy cannot be understated. Medicine does not exist in a vacuum. It operates within a broader societal context, influenced by the voices of families, journalists, activists, and concerned citizens. These forces have the power to challenge prevailing norms, question professional practices, and ultimately drive meaningful change in both perception and policy. In the case of pediatric sedative use, public engagement played a critical role in raising consciousness about potential risks, demanding accountability, and prompting the medical community to reconsider established approaches. Initially, awareness among the general public was limited. Many parents and caregivers trusted that physicians, with their professional expertise, would act in the best interests of their children. Sedatives were often seen as routine remedies for sleeplessness, irritability, or behavioral challenges, and there was little questioning of their safety or long-term impact. Information about adverse effects or dependency risks was scarce, and the nuances of pediatric pharmacology were largely unknown outside the medical community. In this environment, media reports, advocacy campaigns, and educational efforts became essential in bringing hidden issues to light. Media coverage proved particularly influential. Investigative journalism, feature articles, and news reports began to expose instances of overprescribing, side effects, and cases where children suffered unintended consequences from sedative use. By translating complex medical information into narratives that were accessible and compelling to the public, journalists helped bridge the gap between professional knowledge and everyday awareness. Stories of families affected by adverse reactions, often shared with emotional detail and human perspective, evoked public empathy and concern, creating a societal impetus for reform. The media's capacity to reach broad audiences meant that these stories could spark debate, pressure regulators, and motivate professional organizations to review guidelines. Advocacy groups, often composed of parents, pediatricians, educators, and concerned citizens, played a complementary role. These groups organized campaigns, published informational resources, and lobbied policymakers to prioritize children's safety. They highlighted gaps in knowledge, pushed for age-appropriate dosing, and emphasized the importance of alternatives to pharmacological intervention. Advocacy organizations also served as a conduit for collective experience, allowing families to share stories, report incidents, and amplify their voices. This organized effort created a platform that demanded attention from medical authorities and policymakers alike. Public awareness campaigns were particularly effective when they combined emotional resonance with factual information. Educational materials, workshops, and community events aimed to inform parents about the potential risks of sedatives, including dependency, developmental impact, and behavioral consequences. These initiatives emphasized vigilance, encouraging caregivers to ask questions, monitor responses, and consider non-drug interventions whenever possible. By equipping families with knowledge and tools, public awareness efforts helped shift perceptions of sedative use from routine or unquestioned practice to a subject of careful consideration and informed choice. The interplay between media and advocacy also created a feedback loop with medical practice. As public concern grew, healthcare providers faced increased scrutiny regarding prescribing habits and patient education. Doctors began to recognize that families were more informed and engaged, prompting more detailed discussions about risks, benefits, and alternatives. In some cases, heightened awareness led to modifications in clinical guidelines, more conservative prescribing practices, and a stronger emphasis on monitoring children over time. Public engagement thus became a driving force for professional accountability and reflective practice. Moreover, media and advocacy efforts were instrumental in influencing policy. High-profile reporting and organized campaigns often prompted regulatory agencies to reevaluate standards, issue warnings, or mandate changes in labeling and prescribing recommendations. Policymakers, sensitive to public opinion and media attention, were more likely to act when evidence of harm was highlighted alongside widespread societal concern. In this sense, public awareness did not merely educate. It actively shaped the regulatory landscape, reinforcing the connection between social discourse and institutional action. Education through storytelling also played a critical role in shifting cultural attitudes. Books, documentaries, and personal testimonies illustrated the human dimension of sedative use in children, making abstract risks tangible. Parents could relate to the experiences of other families, understand the potential consequences, and consider their own choices more carefully. This narrative approach complemented scientific research, demonstrating that policy and practice are not only guided by data but also by empathy, shared understanding, and social values. The influence of public awareness extended beyond individual families to broader societal debates about child welfare, medical ethics, and parental responsibility. Discussions in the media and advocacy circles encouraged society to reflect on how children are treated within healthcare systems, how risks are communicated, and how the voices of caregivers can be integrated into decision-making. By fostering a culture of questioning and vigilance, public engagement contributed to a more nuanced understanding of medicine, ethics, and the rights of children. Over time, these efforts helped create a more balanced approach to sedative use. While medical expertise remains central, the perspectives of families, advocates, and the public informed practice in meaningful ways. Physicians increasingly considered parental input, discussed non-pharmacological alternatives, and emphasized ongoing monitoring. Policies incorporated mechanisms for public reporting and feedback, ensuring that oversight was informed by lived experience as well as scientific evidence. The result was a healthcare environment where the voices of society were recognized as integral to safe and ethical pediatric care. In reflecting on this chapter, it becomes clear that public awareness, media, and advocacy were not peripheral to the story of sedative use in children, they were central agents of change. By illuminating risks, humanizing consequences, and mobilizing collective concern, these forces challenged complacency and prompted meaningful reforms. They exemplify how social engagement can complement scientific and regulatory efforts, ensuring that medicine serves the best interests of those most vulnerable. Ultimately, the history of public involvement highlights a crucial lesson. Medicine is as much a social endeavor as a scientific one. Children's health is protected not only through research and regulation, but also through informed, engaged, and vigilant communities. Awareness campaigns, media scrutiny, and advocacy work together to ensure that voices outside the professional sphere are heard, respected, and acted upon. The evolving understanding of pediatric sedative use demonstrates that societal oversight, alongside professional and governmental measures, can guide medicine toward more ethical, safe, and responsive practice. By examining this chapter, we see the power of collective awareness in shaping medical norms. The engagement of families, the persistence of advocacy groups, and the reach of the media contributed to a culture in which children's safety is prioritized, risks are acknowledged, and informed choice is promoted. This narrative underscores that vigilance, curiosity, and public involvement are essential in holding institutions accountable, driving reform, and ultimately protecting the most vulnerable members of society. In conclusion, the influence of public awareness, media, and advocacy on pediatric sedative use demonstrates the profound impact that engaged communities can have on medical practice. Their role reminds us that ethical healthcare is not solely the responsibility of doctors or regulators but is a collaborative effort that incorporates the insights, concerns, and experiences of society as a whole. This chapter reinforces the importance of listening, questioning, and acting in the interest of children, highlighting a dynamic interplay between medicine, policy, and the public that continues to shape pediatric care today. As we arrive at the final chapter of our exploration into the history of sedative use in children, it is crucial to pause and reflect on the lessons that history imparts. Every era of medical practice carries with it stories of triumph and caution, innovation and oversight, and nowhere is this more evident than in the case of pediatric sedatives. By examining past mistakes, successes, and societal responses, we gain insight not only into medical science but also into ethical responsibility, critical thinking, and the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting the most vulnerable. This reflection is not merely academic, it is a guide for contemporary practice, shaping how physicians, caregivers, and society at large approach pediatric care today. The first lesson that emerges is the importance of humility in medicine. History demonstrates that even well-intentioned interventions, grounded in the best knowledge available at the time, can lead to unintended consequences. Sedatives were prescribed with the belief that they soothed, calmed, and facilitated rest for children. But in many instances, the side effects, dependency risks, and behavioral impacts were underestimated or overlooked. Recognizing the limits of knowledge and the inherent uncertainty in predicting individual responses to medication is a fundamental step toward safer practice. It reminds healthcare providers to approach pediatric care with caution, to continuously update their understanding based on emerging evidence, and to prioritize ongoing observation and adjustment. A second lesson is the critical value of ethical reflection in clinical decisions. Treating children presents unique responsibilities because they cannot fully advocate for themselves or articulate their experiences with clarity. Every intervention carries moral weight, demanding that caregivers and physicians weigh benefits against potential harms. Historical practices reveal instances where convenience, habit, or systemic pressures may have overshadowed ethical considerations. Today, these reflections inform stricter guidelines, rigorous ethical review, and a heightened emphasis on informed consent even when the patient is a child. The narrative of sedative use serves as a case study in the necessity of embedding ethics into every aspect of pediatric care, ensuring that the child's welfare remains paramount. Another significant lesson concerns the power of vigilance and questioning. History shows that passive acceptance of medical authority can leave children exposed to preventable harm. Societal change often arises when individuals and communities challenge norms, ask difficult questions, and demand transparency. This lesson extends beyond parents to the medical community itself. Continual peer review, professional debate, and critical appraisal of accepted practices are essential mechanisms to detect risk early and correct course when necessary. A culture of questioning grounded in evidence, ethics, and empathy enhances safety and fosters continuous improvement in pediatric care. Additionally, history teaches us the value of comprehensive research and careful observation. Many of the insights gained about sedative use came only after patterns of side effects, dependency, and long-term developmental impacts were documented over time. This underscores the importance of longitudinal studies, careful monitoring, and data-driven evaluation in shaping medical guidelines. By maintaining rigorous research standards, modern pediatric medicine can identify potential risks before they become widespread, preventing the repetition of past mistakes and ensuring interventions are both effective and safe. Interdisciplinary collaboration also emerges as a crucial takeaway. The challenges of pediatric medicine do not reside solely within pharmacology or clinical expertise. They intersect with psychology, education, public health, ethics, and social policy. Historical missteps often arose from a narrow focus, ignoring broader contexts such as family dynamics, developmental psychology, and social determinants of health. Today, lessons from the past encourage a holistic approach. Physicians collaborate with educators, psychologists, and social workers. Regulators consult scientific, ethical, and societal perspectives. And families are actively involved in care planning. This integrated model helps balance therapeutic benefit with broader developmental and social well-being. Public engagement, which we explored in the previous chapter, reinforces another enduring lesson: healthcare is not isolated from society. Parents, advocates, and the media play an essential role in shaping safer practices. Their voices provide checks and balances, drawing attention to potential harms, and ensuring that ethical considerations remain at the forefront. History illustrates that medicine benefits when it listens to society, incorporates diverse perspectives, and responds to feedback with genuine accountability. Encouraging open dialogue between healthcare providers and families is a direct application of these historical lessons. History also underscores the significance of alternative approaches to care. The reliance on sedatives highlights the dangers of defaulting to pharmacological solutions without considering behavioral, environmental, or therapeutic interventions. Today, lessons from the past inform preventive and supportive strategies, sleep hygiene practices, structured routines, behavioral therapies, and family education are emphasized alongside or instead of medication when appropriate. These alternatives are not only safer in many cases but also empower children and families, fostering resilience and healthy coping strategies rather than dependence on drugs. Moreover, the narrative of sedative use illustrates the long-term consequences of oversight. The effects of early interventions may not be immediately apparent, and their cumulative impact can influence development, behavior, and health well into adulthood. This recognition encourages pediatric medicine to adopt a forward-looking perspective, considering not only immediate symptom relief but also lifelong well-being. Historical hindsight equips practitioners with a deeper awareness of risk trajectories, prompting careful deliberation and sustained monitoring. A further lesson involves transparency and communication. Misunderstandings about dosage, side effects, and proper use of sedatives often compounded risks in the past. Clear, consistent, and age-appropriate communication with families is essential to prevent errors and ensure adherence to safe practices. History reminds us that information gaps, whether intentional or accidental, can have profound consequences, and that empowering families with knowledge is both an ethical imperative and a practical safeguard. Importantly, history teaches the value of systemic reflection. Errors and misjudgments are rarely the fault of a single individual. They often reflect systemic weaknesses, insufficient guidelines, inadequate training, limited monitoring, or cultural acceptance of risk. By analyzing these systemic factors, pediatric medicine can implement structural safeguards, improve training, refine protocols, and ensure that individual decisions are supported by robust, evidence-based frameworks. This approach transforms lessons from past missteps into proactive strategies for future safety. Finally, the overarching reflection is one of responsibility and stewardship. Children represent a vulnerable population that relies on adults, physicians, caregivers, society at large for protection. History teaches that safeguarding this population requires vigilance, empathy, critical thinking, and a commitment to continual learning. By acknowledging past errors, celebrating progress, and remaining alert to emerging challenges, society and medicine together can uphold the highest standards of care, ensuring that children are treated with respect, caution, and the benefit of accumulated wisdom. In conclusion, the history of pediatric sedative use offers a rich tapestry of lessons: humility, ethical vigilance, critical questioning, research rigor, interdisciplinary collaboration, public engagement, alternative interventions, foresight, clear communication, systemic reflection, and profound responsibility. These lessons remind us that medicine is not solely a science of the present but a dialogue with the past, informed by history and guided by ethics. By learning from what came before, we can shape safer, more compassionate, and more effective practices in pediatric care. History is both a mirror and a compass. It shows where we have been, and it guides the path forward. Ultimately, reflecting on these events empowers all stakeholders, physicians, families, policymakers, and society to prioritize the welfare of children, making informed, ethical, and conscientious choices. In doing so, the legacy of past practices becomes a foundation for a safer, more responsible, and more enlightened future in pediatric medicine, demonstrating that lessons learned are not merely stories of the past but active tools for protecting generations to come. As we wrap up today's journey through the history of pediatric sedatives, we have explored both the lessons of the past and the insights they offer for a safer future. From understanding the ethical responsibilities of caregivers to recognizing the importance of vigilance, research, and communication, this story reminds us that history is not just a record of what happened, it is a guide for how we can do better, protect the most vulnerable, and make informed choices for generations to come. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this story has given you something to think about, and perhaps even inspired a deeper appreciation for the careful balance between medicine, ethics, and the care of children. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and until next time, take care and keep learning.